Okay. Hi, friends. In this deep dive into the practices that strengthen our discipleship, we're focusing on the practice of service. When plans were made for our church-wide Vision 2020, this month's emphasis on service was to culminate in a day of service in which all of us at Wrightsville Church could select a project and work alongside other members of the congregation in hopes of meeting the needs of the community. Our service was a way of extending the arms of Jesus Christ beyond the walls of the church, a way of being the loving presence of Christ in the world. Because all of that has changed, this deep dive has changed a little as well. We can't work side by side because we're all ordered to stay at home to stop the spread of the highly contagious coronavirus. So we begin this session with the recognition that outreach under these conditions will not look like the outreach we've envisioned before. But then some things are the same, and we want to be clear about what is our mission as followers of Jesus. The towel has long been a sign of service. Jesus modeled service with a selfless act of love, and he used a towel. Do you remember that scene? When Jesus gathered his disciples for the Last Supper, they were having trouble deciding who was greatest among them. This wasn't a new issue for them. But we read in the scriptures, and an argument arose among them as to which of them was greatest. It may have been a conversation about the seating arrangements at the table, but it also could have been about a long-term position in what they considered the establishment of a new government to be established by Jesus, whose popularity and power had been affirmed in all the days since his arrival in Jerusalem. Well, whenever there's trouble over who's the greatest, there's trouble over who is least. So they gathered for the Passover feast, and the disciples were keenly aware that someone needed to wash the other's feet. The problem was that the only people who washed feet were the least, typically a servant of the host. So there they sat, feet caked with dirt. And I want to invite you to imagine just how incredibly dirty that dirt was. The streets were used by one and all. It was such a sore point that they weren't even going to talk about it. No one wanted to be given that task. Nobody wanted to be considered the least. So when Jesus took a towel and a basin of water, he redefined greatness. Having demonstrated servanthood, he then called them to the same way of service. He said, "If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do as I have done to you." In some ways, we'd prefer to hear Jesus call to deny mother and father and houses and land for the sake of the gospel than his word to wash feet. After all, if we give up everything to follow him, we may find ourselves in a mission field in some exotic place, or find ourselves in places of honor where our knowledge or our experience, our talent is needed and valued. But in a pandemic, none of that's possible because we're not going anywhere. Do you know what these people had in common? Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, yes, they were all faith in action in the 20th century. But there's more. Like many others, these Christian leaders served during times of great need and great difficulty. John, who wrote the fourth gospel in the book of Revelation, as well as some letters, wrote while exiled on the island of Patmos during persecution in the 1st century AD. Paul wrote letters from prison. There was Dorcas, also known as Tabitha, who was always doing good and helping the poor, according to the book of Acts. Many have served despite danger and difficulty. Bonhoeffer was a Christian theologian, pastor, and Nazi dissident. And he was sent to a concentration camp, and it was there that he ministered to others in the Holocaust. Bonhoeffer's writings continue to be a gift to believers even to this day, as he reminds us of the cost of discipleship and also the fact that it's worth everything we've got. Mother Teresa cared for the poorest of the poor, although she could have chosen a life of greater comfort in a convent in Ireland. Martin Luther King was a pastor who challenged political leaders, but even more so, leaders of the church and people of the community in the fight for racial justice and civil rights. And his letter from a Birmingham jail is one of many examples of his legacy of service. Yes, they all served, despite danger and difficulty. Now, I, on the other hand, readily point to all the reasons I can't or don't want to serve in this trying time. I've mastered the excuses. I'm part of the vulnerable population. In other words, I'm too old. Stay at home means no contact with others, period. I'm preoccupied with more weighty matters like when will the economy and the access to the beach and parks be open again? Where do you expect me to find a face mask or gloves now? And I really don't have the energy to deal with this right now. And aren't the expectations of Christian outreach suspended in times like this? Pope Francis, I think in his message on Palm Sunday, offered some clarifying words for people like me. The tragedy we are experiencing, COVID-19, summons us to take seriously the things that are serious and not to be caught up in those that matter less. To rediscover that life is of no use if not used to serve others. For life is measured by love. Now that same message comes to us over and over again in the scriptures. In the Old and the New Testaments, we see again and again, love your neighbor. In the book of James, so faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. Jesus said, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. And then in Peter, so then, those who suffer should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. Maybe service is especially expected if you suffer, because you understand pain and fear. And because you trust ultimately in God and not like those who don't, a feeble frame, you must continue to do good. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement in England in the 18th century, again, not a pretty time, offered us 3 simple rules. Do no harm, do good, and stay in love with God. Well, what does all of this mean for us today in the midst of this pandemic? How do we both mitigate the spread of the virus and serve others? I think the first challenge is to work smarter. And we do that when we listen. Listen to the leaders of the community. Listen to the news. Listen as updates are provided on this fight. Listen to neighbors who are isolated and afraid, but only a phone call away. Listen and bear one another's burdens, as we're told in Galatians 6:2. Listen so that you offer something of real value, meeting a real need, rather than just doing something just to be doing it. Listen, or risk doing what feels good to us, but does little for the other. 6 weeks ago, we had no idea that anyone and everyone would need a face mask for day-to-day use. But because some were listening, homemade face masks are becoming available. Now more are needed, but especially as people return to work and some semblance of normalcy, we'll see that increasing need. In our workbook on Vision 2020, still available from the church, we see these words. Wrightsville Church invites you to serve 3 times this month in our community. That's the challenge, to practice service. But whether you serve 3 times or just 1, Give of yourself in a way that meets a real need. The second thing that I think we're challenged to consider is our understanding of the science of serving. Giving activates the same parts of the brain that are stimulated by food and sex. And folks, I couldn't make this up. It means that helping others is pleasurable. It may not feel great at the time we give or serve. Whether you share your time, talent, or treasure, you may feel the recipient isn't grateful or that the task is demeaning. And isn't that like the disdain the disciples felt about washing feet? You may feel like your time's being wasted or that you were motivated by guilt. But in the long run, the pleasure of serving becomes more real. In a gift of levity, a friend sent me a parent's perspective of the first week of homeschooling. And after 5 days of homeschooling, the 7-year-old said in utter frustration, "I hope I don't get the same teacher again next year." You can imagine what mom felt. If serving during a pandemic is good for us as it is good for the recipients, and we must maintain a social distance, how can we serve effectively? Here are just a few suggestions, and I invite your creativity and imagination to take this many, many steps further. Maybe you could prepare a few meals for yourself and some to share. Freeze and give to a healthcare worker who has little time or energy to cook. Give some to a neighbor who's called back to work in May but has no time to grocery shop for lunch at the desk. Offer some to a teacher who's spending most of his or her days delivering food to school children now. Something as simple as soup, a casserole, even just bread or dessert mean a lot to all of us. Pot some herbs or a few pretty plants to share with one who's isolated. Leave it at the door, and if useful, enclose a card with a simple recipe or a practical use for the herb or plant. And wash your hands. Wash your hands as you become the hands of Jesus, remembering that, as St. Francis of Assisi said, it's in giving that we receive. Finally, understand the theology of service. We read in the scriptures the words of the psalmist, "God is faithful and just, a present help in times of trouble." Folks, God did not send this virus to bring us to our knees. God didn't intend to expose the weak of spirit or of body. God is faithful, and that means constant in love, and just, seeking hope and help for all, leaving it to us to correct institutional isms and to right the wrongs of our society. So Jesus said, "You should do as I have done to you." And he intends that we serve one another to demonstrate God's unconditional love. So in this season of social distancing, let's not forget social disparity, which is a long, lonely, relentless reality. Maybe we can advocate for the poor, the uninsured, the unemployed, the underpaid. Maybe we can affirm lawmakers who are trying to protect Americans in our own state or in our nation, even if some of the decisions seem harsh. At least affirm the decision to treat and test victims of COVID-19 without a copay or out-of-pocket expenses. Look for ways to help students who were already behind their peers and now are falling farther behind. Clean off your bookshelves. Deliver a few books to nearby schools that can be shared with students who have few resources at home. Better yet, collect neighborhood sources, books from all your neighbors, and make the gift even larger. Let me close with this. A message from LaShawn Warren, who's the Senior Vice President for the Center for American Progress. From the Exodus and American slavery to the Holocaust and apartheid, faith in action has served as the North Star for generations of believers an enduring force that centered morality in the fight for justice and has helped sustain oppressed people through the worst of times. Where's the North Star pointing to now, in the midst of this pandemic? How can you and I help sustain the people who are discouraged and afraid? How can you support those on the front lines of defense or those who are living in darkness and in need of the light of resurrection hope? I'm praying for all of you and for all of us that we remain strong and faithful to our calling to be the body of Christ, a living body at work beyond the walls of the church. And that's where we are, beyond the walls of the church, more now than ever before, and aware more than ever that the church is not a building, but the church is a people. Thanks be to God. Amen. Thank you.
I didn't stop it.